Hey, welcome to the first half episode of the PLR podcast. In these half episodes, one of us is going to go over a famous leftist text and provide some overview and a brief takeaway, but we're going to reserve judgment for you, the listener. Our goal is simply to make theory easily accessible to everyone. I'm Alex, live from the Turtle Shell. The first text that we're going to go over is called Listen Marxists by the Social Ecologist Murray Bookchin. Bookchin's mission, his intellectual goal, was to point out how the world had progressed to a point where further technological advance and thus environmental degradation were not necessary for people to live happy, productive lives. This isn't reverting backwards technologically, but just stopping technological progress in the name of preserving the natural world. According to Bookchin, the politics of growth, of industry itself, were the disease of the modern world, not capitalism or socialism exclusively. In Listen Marxists, originally published in Anarchos, which is the Journal for the Students for a Democratic Society conference in 1969, Bookchin is addressing young student revolutionaries in Europe and the United States. In the article, he recognizes that capitalism had changed since the 1930s and even since 1917, and that the language that revolutionaries were using, like touting the class line or class struggle, seemed entirely outdated. And he quoted Marx by saying that through this old language, revolutionaries were resurrecting the dead, or in other words, the dead were walking among the living once again. Bookchin's ultimate point was to say that if capitalism had changed so much since Marx, then the language of Marxists and revolutionaries in general had to change as well. He argued that revolutionaries erroneously looked to the past for blueprints on how to conduct a revolution, and thus lacked the creative thought to usher in a new form of praxis. According to Bookchin, this is all evidence that revolutionaries of his day, of 1969, are incapable of revolutionizing themselves and things, much less society as a whole, which they aspire to. According to Bookchin, Marxism is not revolutionary enough because it was born in an era of scarcity that no longer exists. Bookchin wants the new ideology and praxis to transcend Marx in the same way that Marx transcended Hegel. This requires new modes of struggle, new organization, new forms of propaganda, and new lifestyles, and I would add, new rhetoric, an altogether new approach that he called post-scarcity anarchism. This is all by way of introduction. And after that introduction, Bookchin says that rebranding the old form of Marxism, as people do today, by adding the word neo in front of it, doesn't absolve the disconnect between the past and present of capitalism that he's talking about. People today use the term neo-Marxism in order to maintain that Marx's historical materialism, as well as his analysis of class and past revolutions, are still biting interpretational schemata for our world. But Bookchin argues that the issue of scarcity fundamentally renders the past different from today, and that the world of coal and steel that existed during Marx can't be easily transferred to the radically new sources of energy like electronics and cybernetics. So, seeking to cast aside what he calls the ideological debris of the past, the rest of the article goes point by point, defeating two quote-unquote myths of contemporary Marxism. The first myth that Bookchin points out, he calls the myth of the proletariat. And this is a complicated and multifaceted idea. The first part of it maintains that the proletariat of today, contrary to the bourgeoisie of the past, does not own the economic means of production or economic power. In fact, the proletariat isn't even a majority of the population. And so that means that, in fact, the proletariat, the working class, is easily subsumed under the existence of capitalism. Working life today renews the social relations of capitalism, as Marx said, but it also, according to Bookchin, renews the psyche, the values, and the ideology of capitalism, which makes capitalist existence itself, your life under capitalism, normal to the worker. Class differences in that case are normalized or not seen. Workers can't even fathom living outside a capitalist system, which means they don't want to listen to some theory buff ramble in a factory about quote-unquote class consciousness. Instead, the goal for Bookchin is to obliterate worker-ness, not to impose class consciousness. Worker-ness, Bookchin says, is the workers' obedience to bosses, their respect for hierarchy of all forms, and their consumerism, among other things. Thus, the goal for Bookchin is to achieve what he calls unclass consciousness, or the elimination of class altogether. The next myth that he defeats is called the myth of the party, and simply put, that means that revolutions are not made by parties. They're made as a result of deep-seated historic forces and contradictions that activate large sections of the population. So, applied to today, Bookchin might be saying that a form of praxis might not be to create a new party, but to allow people to come together independently, an independent organization. In the last part, Bookchin offers two traditions for aspiring radicals. The first is Marxist centralism, which privileged the party members and used the language of old, archaic Marxism. This is what we got in the Soviet Union over time. The second tradition that Bookchin argues is anarchism, or what he calls the movement of humanity against coercion of all forms. Anarchists encourage spontaneity of the masses rather than party, to preserve the spirit of revolt and practice direct action. And contrary to popular assumptions, they believe that movements must be disciplined, coordinated, and planned for unity, but on a voluntary basis, not by coercion, by means of self-discipline nourished by conviction and understanding. So, anarchists want to go beyond the Marxist revolutions by looking forward at what a true non-hierarchical society and revolutionary program could look like. So, whether you're Marxist or not, Bookchin's article offers a lot of food for thought. Old words like vanguard party, intelligentsia, and even class society are words that belong to the world of scarcity and disciplined factory work. And in order to break the shell that has encapsulated the worker within capitalism, we have to cast away these old words, this old rhetoric of working class consciousness. There's no doubt that our time does offer a different reality than 1917 or 1930, and that race, gender, and sexuality have all problematized these categories that, in reality, were articulated mainly with men in mind. And this is a point that Bookchin doesn't make in 1969, but that we're making here. Bookchin's idea of the disappearance of the working class is also good, but it's not altogether novel. Some theorists like Moïse Postone have argued that Marx's goal in fact was the disappearance of the working class as such. But Bookchin's idea that workers need to cast off their quote-unquote workerness can help us today to lead people to question some of the social relations they take for granted in the workplace and outside of it. Some of these embedded hierarchies that exist in our day-to-day life are worth questioning. As revolutionaries, it's always our job to keep the future in our sight, while remembering the errors in the ways of the past. Bolsheviks accomplished a lot, and Bookchin is willing to admit this. But he's saying that we need, as revolutionaries, to push more towards post-scarcity society that provides for all, and that is not centralized. After all, isn't it true that capitalist society today produces enough food and goods to supply the world? I'm looking at you, particularly Dunkin' Donuts and Honeydew, for throwing away your food every night. If the economic conditions of our world have changed so much since the time of Marx, shouldn't our rhetoric and praxis also change with it? Could a new form of revolutionaryism usher in a left utopia better than resurrecting the ghosts of the past?